All right. Good evening. Go ahead and get started. So let's begin by setting a positive motivation. As we know, the Course is helping us to become familiar with the wisdom of the Lamrim, the wisdom of the Buddha's sutra teachings, as they are condensed and organized in a systematic fashion for our personal practice in the Lamrim. So the purpose of doing that is to understand how to practice the Buddha's teachings. How to put them into practice to get the results of the small scope, the middle scope, and the great scope. To achieve those meditative realizations. So we develop, again, those minds of confidence in the power of the wisdom, and our motivation for studying and practicing is to fully traverse the stages of the path and actualize even the great scope, to become a Buddha ourselves for the benefit of all sentient beings. So we establish those minds of faith and bodhicitta. All right. So, before we move into new material, are there any questions from anything that was said last week? Or on, I guess it was last week, Thursday. Okay. So as I mentioned, as we were closing last week, the next several contemplations are going to go over the 4 characteristics of karma. So of course we've said that karma is a deeply hidden phenomena, meaning that we ourselves aren't able to puzzle it out using logic, using reasoning. So what we're left with are statements, observations of the historical Buddha as to the rules of karma. And we've talked a little bit about some of those, how there's a relationship between the energy of the mind and external reality, how those two things are connected, and that connection can allow for the arising of karmic experiences in future lifetimes. So even though it's a deeply hidden phenomena, what that doesn't mean that no one understands it, and that no one has left guidelines and information that we can use to put into practice. It only means that for us individually at present, we can't independently validate those, all of those specific claims. So here we've got 4 new claims about the functioning of karma. And those are that Karma is specific, karma is expandable, karma is personal, and karma is definite. So um, uh, karma is specific, karma is expandable, karma is personal, and karma is definite. Sometimes when they say, so, or I guess it depends on how you want to think about it, how you want to translate the different, because I prefer Lama Yeshe here in day 175. That's the first in the quotation. He says specific reaction. Every single action performed by our body, speech, or mind eventually produces a specific reaction. And so that's why I typically use the word specific to refer to this characteristic. But then you'll see in the comment, it does go on to say that karma is definite. And that is actually, I think, more typical in terms of the translation of this specific, sorry, of this first characteristic of karma. However, the last characteristic of karma, I said definite. Another way that's commonly translated is never lost. The karma is never lost. But when that is taught, very often when it's further explained, they'll say something like, the karma is definite to be experienced. And that to me makes it confusing to use the word definite in two contexts. So I guess either way, it's probably confusing, but because, either way, you're going to read things in more expanded commentaries that are going to sort of use the same, but as a way of just remembering the four, I say specific, expandable, personal, and definite. Because if you don't say, so yeah, so it's because that avoids using definite twice. That's just how I remember it. Okay, so the first of the four is that karma is specific. And what this is getting at, the aspect of karma that this is getting at, is that there is a relationship, again, as we've talked about, a relationship between the karmic seed that is laid down and the ripening result of that karmic seed, that karmic potential. So when an action is engaged in, if the motivation of that action is non-virtuous, then it will ripen as a suffering result, as a painful, difficult, obstructive result. So that to me, because that's the meaning of this characteristic, I feel like specific is a really good word to use because it's getting at that relationship between the energy that's present in the mind when the karmic seed is laid down and the kind of result that ripens when that energy, when the causes and the conditions come together for that karmic seed to ripen as an experience. And that correlation is infallible. That correlation isn't like, well, sometimes it's like that, and sometimes it's something. It's a one-to-one correlation that can't be broken. That if the energy is virtuous, the result will be positive, pleasant, supportive, etc. If the energy is non-virtuous, the result will be painful, suffering, difficult, etc. Now, of course, that depends, it's also true, of course, that at least in some situations, perhaps mainly if that karma is ripening for humans, then at that time, we as humans with intelligence and so on, we can lay down tendencies or habits in the mind that can reframe what is occurring, and maybe we don't experience it, as painful or so on. Of course, we have that choice. Now, could be that that's unique in terms of reality as a whole. Animals, hungry ghosts, hell beings, etc. They don't really have that option. Um, but we can't say that if you get into a car accident or you get ill or your house burns down or something, we can't say that that's a pleasant experience in general. We can say that we have a choice, depending upon how we familiarized our mind, what tendencies, what habits we have in our mind. To some degree, we can transform experiences. But still, what this is getting at is that it's challenging. It's at least we can say it's a challenging experience. Nobody's going to get into a car accident on purpose, in order to, or burn their house down intentionally just to experience that as a thing to do. It's an obstacle. It's a challenging experience. Whether it gives rise to real suffering, we have, depending on the person and the circumstances, there's control over that. But the experience itself is going to have a quality that is unpleasant. Okay, so, and of course, he does point out here and other places that karma is not inevitable, that karma is not destiny, that there isn't something that if it's a negative karma, that there isn't something that we can do. Of course, I think we're all probably familiar about purification, familiar of purification practice. And so there are ameliorative things that we can do if we've created a negative karma. And of course, there are also ways that we can interfere unintentionally with a positive karma, as we've alluded to before. If we regret engaging in a positive karma, we lessen the impact, and we don't want to lessen the impact of a positive karma. If we regret a negative karma, we lessen the impact, and we do want to lessen the impact of a negative karma. And then, of course, it's he addresses kind of an ancient sort of the relationship historically between the idea of karma, that it predated the Buddha, and which was different in various ways from how the Buddha presented karma, after his, in his lifetime, because the concept itself isn't something that the Buddha fully invented. It was an idea, but the idea was a bit different. The way that it was presented prior in India and so on was sort of as destiny, was sort of as this immutable fact, kind of like skin color. Which is what gave rise to the caste system in India, in a way. That at the moment of your birth, if you happen to have been born to a family that had a particular social status, then that meant that was your karma, that you were like that. You were an untouchable, you were a Brahmin, whatever it might be. And the Buddha completely rejected that understanding of karma. That yes, it's true, of course, that if you're born into having resources, not having resources, etc., then at that moment of your birth, there is a karmic seed that correlated with that experience. Otherwise, you would have been born under different circumstances. So there is the arising of a karmic seed that does at that time correlate to having resources, not having resources, whatever it might be. But it's a dynamic process. And so at some point, could be a week later, a month later, 5 years later, different karma can ripen and things can move in a different direction. And so the Buddha's view of karma is dynamic and not this kind of, immutable part of a person, like their eye color or their skin color or something, where, if you're born that way, well, then that's a truth about you forever. He says if we direct our conscious energy one way, one kind of result will come. If we direct it another way, a different kind of result will come. He says once we've ascertained that, we'll see that we are responsible for what we do. We can determine what we do and what happens to us. It's more up to us than our circumstances, friends, society, or anything outside of us. So because it's a dynamic process, we are really in the driver's seat. We do, of course, inherent, of course, the infant, at that moment, they've inherited a karmic seed from a previous life, and that does happen. That happens. That has happened to all of us, whatever our kind of situation was at that time. But we get more and more control over that, and the more that we study, the more that we learn, the more access that we develop, to our own mind, the more insight that we have into our motivations, the more introspective awareness that we're able to generate, the better that we will be able to shift our karma and to create the kinds of karma, positive karmic seeds that are beneficial, and reduce the impact of the karmic seeds that could give rise to suffering. All right. So that's the first of the 4 characteristics. Any thoughts or questions so far? Yes, Kodo.
In the beginning, you said something about mind and
Don't think that's specific enough for me to answer.
oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Sorry, I don't know what you mean.
What was your question?
She said that I said something about the mind and something else. And what did I mean?
No, what did you say?
Or
I didn't get the memo.
and I have no idea.
I'll have to listen to this.
Any other questions? Okay, so the second characteristic of karma on day 176 is Lama Zopa is saying here karma is expandable much more than ordinary phenomena. The commentary says that the second characteristic is that it is expandable. It shows great increase. He says, for example, if we fail to purify the act of killing an insect after 15 days, it becomes the equivalent of having killed a human being. Without purification, the potential for suffering increases hour by hour and day by day. It doubles, quadruples, and then just keeps multiplying like that. It is like planting a seed that becomes a shoot, then a sapling, and then a tree with a trunk, branches, leaves, and flowers, and many seeds that drop to the ground to create more trees. An entire forest can come from one small seed. So, of course, this is like because karma encompasses positive and negative karmas, then there's aspects of this that are concerning, and there's aspects of this that are great. In the sense that even if we create a small virtuous seed, as long as we don't regret it, as long as we don't interfere with it, the results of that also increase over time and lead to results that are much greater than you would otherwise expect. I think there's a story in the sutras about, like a child offering a flower to the Buddha. And in that sutra, the Buddha prophesied that, that child, due to the karma of that, would, something like become, a wheel turning Buddha at some point, billions of years, or, who knows. But that the power of that, completely innocuous, action, because of the power of the karmic object of a Buddha, and maybe the purity of that child's motivation, would have this incredible result. So of course, that's quite nice, but it is also underscoring the importance of purification practice. In the sense that we should probably not skip purification practice, that we should try to have that be something that we engage in daily, in order to cut off this process of the ripening of karma. So, yeah, so, I can't, this one seems to be a bit harder to sort of intellectually wrap one's head around, but than the first. But yeah, the Buddha, of course, it depends upon developing the view that the Buddha is a reliable guide, and that the Buddha's teachings are non-deceptive, and they're meant only to help us to make progress. So it certainly is underscoring the importance of dealing with our negative karma, and not just thinking, well, the negative karma itself was quite small, and so it doesn't need to be included. But perhaps we can, just include, as we're doing purification practice, we just think, when we're trying to purify, the karma of killing, for example, we just, as we're doing that, we make sure to mentally sort of include, oh, well, it's not just this specific instance of, maybe a mouse or something, but we think, even if I've ever killed a mosquito, or if I've ever killed an ant, we don't have to sit there and, think of every single time that we've ever killed this ant and this ant, and like keep a journal, and, but we just kind of broadly think, well, even insects, their lives are precious to them. They, they guard their life. They move away from aversive stimuli, and they try to, they move toward things that support their life, food and water and so on. And so they're protecting their life, just like I'm protecting my life. And so if I have accidentally or intentionally ever, then I regret having done that. And I'm including that in my thinking about, because we also need to think about past lives. So, of course, we're also thinking about killing of humans in past lives. And, So we just sort of broadly, because after we get through the 4 characteristics, we're going to look at the 10 non-virtuous actions. So we can kind of broadly consider, any act of killing, and just in a general way think about, well, certainly in the past I've killed human beings. Certainly in the past I've, hunted for sport. I've done, and, we just sort of generally think about, we don't have to obsess over each individual time, but we can look at the broad strokes of the negative karmas, um, and just sort of think, well, if I have ever done that, I regret that I, under the influence of delusion, not knowing any better, being overcome by whatever it might be, I engaged in an unskillful action, and I regret that, and then I purify it, and um, you know have confidence that it's fully purified.
That was my question. How do you know? Because, I do Vajrasattva, 5 days a week. And I, I've gone through, the whole killing this life, previous lives. How do you know when to stop purifying for the past lives?
Yeah, I mean, in Buddhism, they don't advise us that we ought to kind of ever stop, that we should. Now, I think, that's a particularly difficult, kind of impersonal thing. So I think it's good also to get the perspectives on that from higher lamas in particular, and, Geshe Sherab and other people, because we don't, if there's something that, is like particularly, I think, with respect to things that we might be troubled by, that we can remember, because I feel like there's a difference. We don't, intellectually we know that, in past lives there's probably more intense things, but also even in this life there's certainly things that, when we reflect on, they bother us, and they can even give rise to strong, feelings. And we certainly don't want to be beating ourselves up. And that's certainly, I mean, that's not the intent of regret. Venerable Rubino in particular is very good about, discussing the differences between, regret and something more like guilt. So we don't want to get caught in a cycle of feeling, shame about having engaged in an unskillful action due to the arising of strong negativity, or just the absence of familiarity with the antidotes. But we still need to acknowledge that that is a karmic seed in the mind, and we don't want that karmic seed to ripen. We don't want that karmic seed to bring a suffering result. And so we do need to purify it without getting caught up in a spiral of personal kind of shame, and, feeling overwhelmed by sort of a really personal sense of, of guilt in that way. But I would say that because ultimately the thing that cuts the ripening of all of this mass of negativities from beginningless past lives is a direct realization of emptiness. That's, that's the thing that we're striving for, because as I generally understand it, for most people, even at that, up to that point, no one is really eliminating all negativity from their mind on the basis of purification practice. Purification practice is sort of the vehicle that we have, that we're using um, on an ongoing basis, but still in the mind of someone who just directly perceived the nature of reality directly, there was still negativity, in their mind, even though they were the same. They were using purification practice as their vehicle. So it's kind of like the best vehicle that we have to get rid of as much as possible. But I don't know that they really say, of course, there's a teaching that suggests that after 100,000 Vajrasattva mantras, full Vajrasattva mantras, in the context of purification practice, so meaning not just, you can recite the Vajrasattva mantra whenever you want to, and that's perfectly, not unreasonable, but without generating the four opponent powers in the context of a practice of purification, then it doesn't have the same power. It's not being used as in the context of the four opponent powers if you're just reciting it while you're in the car, or do that too if you want to, and I'm sure that there's some benefit to that. And but 100,000 recitations of the full mantra in the context of the four opponent powers is said to close the door to the lower realms. Now, that doesn't mean that there's no negativity left in the mind, because, of course, in the upper realms, we still have difficult, challenging experiences. And so that is the ripening of negativity, previous negative karmas. But one could argue that shooting for 100,000 recitations of the full Vajrasattva mantra in the context of the four opponent powers is a laudable goal. To the extent to which it depends on concentration, I can't. I think, oftentimes there is a role that concentration plays in the power of our practice. And so that also indicates that making progress in our ability to concentrate is also something that's broadly talked about in general. But it's pretty clear, that to me, I mean, from what I understand, that all practitioners will be under the influence of negativity up until the moment that they directly perceive emptiness. That negativity is, those karmic seeds are still present in the mind, but what the analogy that they kind of give is that that direct non-conceptual realization sort of burns the ground in which those negative karmas can ripen. So it's sort of like you have a field where all of those seeds, they're still there. You still created them. They haven't ripened. They're still present, but you've sort of burned the earth or salted the earth, and they're no longer operative. They can no longer bring their result, which is what you want. So for me, and for many people, the challenging thing that it turns on is, as I mentioned, kind of those memories that we find sort of painful, that I don't know that I have the skill to address in a meaningful way. But I would say that from what I understand, we're meant to never abandon engaging in purification practice with respect to the categories of non-virtue, like the 10 non-virtuous actions as categories of behavior, categories of karma, until we directly perceive the nature of reality, and then probably we don't need to anymore, from what I would gather.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
Hi, Venerable. It seems to me that the combination of Vajrasattva practice, whether you've done a retreat to do the 100,000 or whether you're doing it sincerely with all the conditions, etc., in tandem with the practice, the different practices that you may have, or the attempting to lead a virtuous life, that all of those are you there?
You kind of froze there for a minute, but
Yeah, I've got a lot of that happening, I'm afraid. I'll try to make it really short. That all of those in combination have reduced the tendencies and habits of negative actions. And I only say that because I know that I'm a different person than I was 10 or 15 years ago. And I know in my heart that for all of those reasons, that is why. So I don't know if you could simply do Vajrasattva and think that that's gonna, I mean, I know you're gonna say, of course, but you know, that there's so much involved with purification, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
Mhm. Yeah, and I mean, of course, Vajrasattva isn't the only. Of course, there's 35 confession butter practice, and they would say that any time that we and meditating on emptiness, because again, like I said, that's the thing that's ultimately the most effective. But even as you're saying, meditating on love and compassion and generosity, those are all, in a way, forms of purification because, I mean, if you look psychologically at the four opponent powers, it is about acknowledging that we have tendencies and habits that are unskillful and then replacing them with, more skillful, like refraining from engaging in that kind of introspective awareness, that kind of restraint. And that's also true when we're meditating on patience, or we're meditating on loving kindness, or we're meditating on generosity. We're also recognizing, oh, I have a tendency to be miserly, or I have a tendency to generate ill will. And so in place of that, I would like to spend time familiarizing my mind with its antidote, with its opposite, with generosity, with patience, with loving kindness, etc. And that is a form of purification in and of itself, because um, it's reducing the energy that's present in the mind that is non-virtuous, and supplanting it with a tendency and a habit that is virtuous. So it performs the role of purification. The idea of quote unquote formal purification practice, what's unique about it is really just the inclusion of the enlightened beings that are part of those practices. And so there's an additional layer there where there's the actual energy of these specific enlightened beings who made vows, made commitments, made prayers to help sentient beings with respect to their negative karma. So, in a way, you could think about it in the same way that you think about, I mean, not you, but maybe the way that I would think about, Tara practice, or Chenrezig practice. These are, I can also, I can meditate on the things, I can meditate on compassion analytically, I can meditate on overcoming, developing kind of a courageous attitude analytically, and I should, and I am, but I'm also relying on Tara. I'm also relying on Avalokiteshvara because of the prayers and the um, you know commitments and vows that they made, and that specific energy of enlightened mind, enlightened activity that's unique, that supplements and supports other things that are more analytical that I'm also doing. That's why, that's what I would say is the unique role of 35 Confession Buddha practice, Vajrasattva practice. But really, they would say that, as I mentioned, all of these are sort of conventional antidotes, that ultimately it's wisdom realizing emptiness that solves all of these problems, and that's the one thing that we're kind of using all of these things as a way of creating the kinds of causes and conditions that allow us to realize emptiness directly. We're trying to really, up until then, we are reducing negativities where, but still we're creating, no matter how good we are at these things, still we're creating new negativities, and it's sort of a mixed bag, of positive and negative. So really burning the ground in which all negativity can operate is the goal, and that is wisdom realizing emptiness. And we just have to sort of engage in all of these things to get us to that point, to try to help create the causes and the conditions that will give us the space, the time, the circumstances, the access to teachers and resources and supportive, conducive conditions, so that that particular insight, which is more subtle and more difficult and takes more time and more merit and so on, that can dawn in the mind, is how I would say.
I agree. I'm always amazed at the I guess the big gift that we're given in being told to do your practice. I mean, it is every practice, every sadhana that you do is full of jam-packed with purification practice. So when we're told to do it, it's for our own good.
Any other thoughts? Okay, so the third, day 177, Lama Zopa says, without creating the cause, there's no way to experience the result. So this is personal. This is the karma is personal. So karma is specific, expandable, and now personal is the third. So this means that if we are experiencing something, then we can infer that it was the mind that is associated with this body that at some point was the same mind that created the karmic seed that is now ripening. So as I mentioned, I don't know, I've probably mentioned in this course, maybe in this section, there's a way of thinking about this that I heard maybe from Venerable Yinton for the first time, or maybe Venerable Choki, I don't know. But the phrasing of it I really like, which is, we don't have to think about karma as being our fault, but we do have to think about it as being our responsibility. Because even though, because it could be a karmic seed that we've inherited from a billion years ago, and there's no logical way of thinking about that as, well, that's my fault. And yet, just like if if your roof is leaking and maybe the previous owner, but I mean, of course, we are the previous owner, in a sense, but not in a personal sense, but still, like, we don't have to think, oh, well, I did this, but we do have to think, well, this is now my roof, and it is leaking. So ignoring it isn't helpful, just pretending like it's not leaking or pretending like there isn't a hole, isn't going to accomplish anything. We do need to patch that roof, even if we feel like, well, I don't remember, doing anything that could have caused this hole. We have moved into a roof into a home in which there is a hole in the roof. And so it becomes our responsibility to do something about it. So in this way, we can't blame, in this way, we have to take responsibility. We can't say, we don't have to feel a sense of personal guilt or a sense of like, but now this is this is something that I have to deal with, because this isn't someone else that did this. This isn't a different mind. This wasn't, my neighbor. This wasn't my parents. And in this way, another benefit is that by thinking in this way, it really helps us to not give rise to negativity, because if we get accustomed to thinking in this way, the benefit is that the cooperative condition, which might be outside of ourselves, is no longer the thing that we blame. We no longer think, oh, well, how dare the previous owner of my house not look after the roof of the house that I've moved into, and so I'm going to take them to court. We think, well, if I didn't have the karmic seed in my mind to experience this, then I would never have moved into a house in which this is the case. I have the karma to be experiencing this, and therefore that requires that in a previous life, or perhaps in earlier in this life, not so likely, less likely for that to be true, but could be true. I, I, loosely I, meaning the mind that is associated with this body, was associated with a different body in a previous life, and a cause was created, and now that cause has met with these external cooperative causes and conditions, and my own karmic seed is now coming to fruition, and I am having this result. And so we can't say, oh, well, how dare that person do this, or how dare this happen to me, because if my karma was different, my experience would be different. So this is helpful in being able to experience things that are challenging without blaming and giving rise to anger, because we can see how it would not be happening to me had that karmic cause not been created. So, we can think, well, in a previous life, that combination of body and mind lacked the awareness, lacked the capacity to avoid non-virtue. And then this karmic seed was laid down, and now the cooperative causes and conditions are coming together, and they're giving rise to an experience that I'm finding quite challenging. But there's no way of thinking about that other than I need to take responsibility for fixing this, because I can't lay blame to the ripening of that to anywhere other than this mind that I possess. And so the origin of that experience is in this mind. Nobody else has access to this mind but me. So, as unfair as it might be, just like my neighbor is not going to come over and fix the hole in my roof. It's my name on the deed. It's my, legally, I have to deal with it. So I have to address what the content of my mind is. I don't have to do that in a way where I feel a heavy sense of, again, guilt or shame or what have you. But to think that someone else is going to do it is not productive and not accurate. I have access to my mind, and therefore the karmic seeds that are present in my mind, regardless of the circumstances, regardless of how we might not think it's fair, they are what I have inherited, and they are what I must address. Okay. Any thoughts or questions about that third characteristic?
That explains the teeth.
Okay, so the last thing that we'll address today is the fourth characteristic of karma, day 178. As Zopa says, no matter how heavy or how small, karma is never lost. So karma is definite, karma is expandable, karma is personal, and karma is, karma is specific. Even I didn't do that correct. Karma is specific, karma is expandable, karma is personal, and here karma is definite, to be experienced. That when the karmic, so what we can say here is that once a karmic seed has been laid down in the mind, once a karmic action of body, speech, or mind has been engaged in, then that karmic seed, that karmic potential is now implanted in the mind, and it is definite to be experienced, no matter how long it takes. The causes and the conditions eventually will ripen as experience. And of course, the caveat here is in the absence of an interfering force, in the absence of something that cuts that off. It's sort of like the example that I usually give is like if you have a table that's relatively small, it's not an infinitely long table, and you have a marble on the table, and you smack the marble with, a relative degree of force. You don't have to actually witness the marble falling off the table. You can just look at that first moment and you can understand the nature of the table, the nature of the marble, the degree of force that was present in that first instant. And you can say with certainty that that marble is going to fall off that table. But that doesn't preclude that you can put your hand out, or you can put, a cup over it, or you can put some sort of block, some sort of wall or something that marble will smack into, and not fall off the edge of that table. Even the 5 actions of immediate retribution can be purified. They can be, even those extremely powerful negative karmas can be purified. And of course, even a positive action, as we've said, we can inadvertently reduce the power of a positive action. But both of those things can be true. We can say, you can look at that in the first instance and be certain that that result, will manifest, and also say that that doesn't preclude that something can be done about it, that you can. Now, of course, we may not have enough time, like for example with the 5 actions of immediate retribution. We don't have a lot of time to purify that, because we know that it's going to manifest at our death. So we only have however many years to purify that negative karma. And it could be we only have a few hours or days, and it could be an insufficient amount of time. Just like if you have a particularly small table and you hit a marble at a high velocity, you've got a very, very small window of time to do something about that. It's not impossible. You could devise a method. That person could. There's, of course, examples. Milarepa engaged in a lot of negative actions, but still became fully enlightened in that same lifetime. So it just means that some causes and conditions are more difficult than others, but still you could devise a way of dealing with it that would be effective. But some things are more practicable, or you can imagine that it's easier under certain circumstances versus other circumstances. But in general, all we can say is that that these karmic seeds do remain in the mind, and that there's no kind of natural, that under their own power they don't dissipate. It isn't that they're time limited by in and of themselves, that it isn't that like, oh, okay, it's been 100,000 years and the causes and conditions for that particular karmic seed to ripen just haven't come together yet, and so of its own accord that karmic seed loses its power to ripen. That is not the way that it works. That karmic seed will remain dormant, will remain latent in the mind, regardless of how long it takes. And when the karmic causes and conditions come together, that karmic seed will produce a result, whether it's a positive result or a negative result. There will come a point, even if it takes trillions and trillions of years, there will come a point where that karmic seed will meet with the correct cooperative causes and conditions and will ripen as experience, unless we do something actively to interfere. Again, could be either some form of purification, could be, if it's accidental, then some form of regretting something that was positive, or could be directly perceiving the nature of reality, which is going to all at once deal with all of our remaining negative karma at that time. So, yeah. Any thoughts or questions about the 4th characteristic of karma? Okay, so after this, the next section is going to go into the 10 non-virtuous actions and their results. So we'll get more insight into generally what we can expect, the correlation between specific non-virtues and specific karmic results in the next, probably for the next few days. So if there are no final thoughts or questions, then we'll end with dedication. So we bring to mind our positive motivation, and we think that we've studied, we've listened, we've participated, and that's created positive energy in the mind. And we want that positive energy not to just ripen in a general positive way, but we want it to ripen in a specific, useful, spiritual way. So just bring to mind how you yourself want that karma to ripen in a way that is beneficial spiritually for oneself and others. Sealing it in that positive direction. All right. So we will meet again on Thursday.